Today's topic is food and government, and we have two speakers here today. We have Alice Kamps, who's the curator at the National Archives, and Professor John Banzhaf, who's law professor here at George Washington University. Alice Kamps curated an exhibit at the National Archives called What's Cooking Uncle Sam, that was there from June 2011 through January 2012. In the flyer for the exhibit, it says that government has been a factor in production, regulation, research, innovation, and economics of our food supply. And we're going to be looking at all those things today. I think both speakers are going to be touch upon those things. Alice came to DC about 4 years ago. That exhibit was her first exhibit at the National Archives. It included over 100 original records related to food. It's actually in the process of working on a traveling exhibit right now. Before that, she was an independent exhibit developer in Chicago. She had exhibits at the Field Museum and Shedd Aquarium. She's been in the museum field for her whole career. She started at the Chicago Children's Museum. In conjunction with the exhibit at the National Archives, José opened a pop-up restaurant called America Eats and used the resources from the National Archives to research and create the menu for the restaurant. I loved it. It's a shame it's not around anymore. But I'm delighted to have Alice Kamps here today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. This morning, as I was preparing to speak to you today, I thought I'd watch some of the lectures that you had seen previously, which may not have been a great idea, because as I watched them, I realized that not only was this probably going to be videotaped, but that I was going to be seated in front of you, and that you were all surely going to see the hole in my stocking right here, which was going to be hidden if I had been standing. I guess I could have run out and gotten another pair, but that would have seriously cut into my fretting time, and I had to sit in my office and fret for a while. So I'm going to be telling you some stories from the exhibit and showing you some of the records. Hopefully you'll see a little bit about the scope and the history of how the government has been involved in what we eat, some of the many different ways. I found that some of our concerns have been very, very consistent over the 200 or so years of our history. But I also found a lot of surprises in the reasons that the government got involved initially in some of the ways that it has. There are three what I think of as kind of food crusaders who are featured in the exhibit and in my lecture today, and this is by far my favorite. This is Frank N. Meyer. He was a plant explorer for the Bureau of Plant Industry in the Department of Agriculture, beginning in 1905. For about 10 years, he went on expeditions around the world, and he brought plants and seeds back to this country. They used those plants to test in our different soils and climates. They bred them with native plants for some of their favorable traits. But I like to think of him, he's kind of the Vincent van Gogh of the botany world. He was born in Holland and came to this country as a young man. And he was recruited by the Department of Agriculture in part for his willingness to walk long distances. And that was indeed a very important part of his job. This map shows one of his expeditions to Asia, to China, Russia, Turkestan, and Manchuria that he went on between 1909 and 1911. Each of those little black dots represents a spot where he stopped and collected plants. And he covered that area almost entirely and exclusively on foot. He traveled in Asia at a time when very few Westerners, and in places where very few, if any, Westerners had visited. And it was a very dangerous time. It was a time when it was after the Boxer Rebellion, during which people had sworn off or had sworn to kill all foreigners. So there was a lot of animosity towards foreigners at the time. There were certainly no traveler's checks or universal currency. He had to go and find translators and on guides, and sometimes his translators and guides would disappear in the middle of the night. He crossed rickety bridges over chasms. He forded icy streams, but he was really dedicated to this cause. He felt that this was the greatest good he could do for this country, his adopted country, was to bring these plants to us. And in fact, he wasn't the first American to have that feeling. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, on their diplomatic missions abroad, both collected foreign seeds and brought them back. Thomas Jefferson, in fact, risked death by smuggling rice out of Italy in his pocket. It was a crime punishable by death at the time. The Italians are very serious about their rice. But he also felt that this was very important, and he thought that his introduction of European rice and olive trees to this country was one of his greatest achievements, right up there with the writing of the Declaration of Independence. He endured all these hardships. He brought over 2,500 different plants back to this country. Very few of our fruits and vegetables are native to this country. And there's one that's named after him. Does anybody know what it is? Meyer lemon, yes. This is the Meyer of the Meyer lemon, which he discovered in China. So one way that government got involved, in one of the earliest ways, was through plant exploration and seed distribution. Another way that it was involved in agriculture was through market controls. And the earliest example of this was done to protect farmers from something that I like to call crimes against butter, which as a Wisconsin girl, I was born in Wisconsin, I feel very strongly about still. Does anybody know when or why margarine was originally invented? Yeah.
People thought butter was bad for you, so they wanted to lower, better substitute.
There was a period where we did believe that, fortunately, I think somewhat erroneously, that margarine was better for you. But it was originally invented because Emperor Napoleon said that he would give a reward to the first person who could come up with a substitute for butter. And a few years later, a French scientist did. And it was more for reasons that it kept longer. So it was something armies could take out to the field with them. But also it was a great deal cheaper than butter. So it had great commercial possibilities, which was certainly recognized in this country, much to the dismay of the dairy farmers. We have thousands of petitions that were written by dairy farmers asking Congress to do something. And they weren't expressing concern just about their livelihoods. They claimed that this greasy counterfeit, they called it, was going to spoil our children's health and truly our American way of life. So in I believe it was 1888, they passed the Margarine Act, and this act levied taxes and licensing fees on margarine, which effectively brought the price up to be the same as butter. So it really lost its edge in the competition there. Later amendments taxed colored margarine. You may have heard stories of people mixing. They sold for a period. They sold a little packet of dye with the margarine that people would mix in because nobody wants to eat it when it's just white. One senator tried to pass a law that only pink margarine could be sold. That, fortunately, didn't go anywhere. But with these taxes and licensing fees, it created a black market for margarine. And it seems sort of amusing to us now, but the penalties for dealing in counterfeit colored margarine, not counterfeit margarine, for selling colored margarine without paying the fees were very severe. And this man went to Leavenworth Penitentiary for a year in 1916 for his crimes against butter. I gave a tour to a group from Wisconsin once, and they asked me how long he was in jail. And when I told them 1 year, they said, "That's all." So that was the first market intervention. Of course, the major intervention was during the Great Depression, when Supplies were up and demand was down, and prices dropped, and farmers were losing their farms and their businesses and their livelihoods, and they turned to government for help at that time as well. And part of the New Deal was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which gave farmers subsidies and loans to leave part of their land fallow. So they reduced the supply so that the prices could go back up. This is, in essence, our first farm bill. And the system of price supports and subsidies is the basis of today's farm policy. So this is what dates back to this period here. I'd like to talk now about what happened as our country industrialized and people were more and more removed from the source of their food. They stopped growing their own food. They began to purchase convenience foods. And because of this, they didn't see these foods being produced any longer and didn't always know where they came from. They became vulnerable to what was called adulteration. And that was adding chemicals or other materials to heighten the color, soften the texture, or modify the flavor of foods. This image right here is the cover of a Puck magazine. It was published in New York in 1884, and the caption is, "Look before you eat." And this was such a prevalent practice that here we see this man, and they're saying, basically, you need to be a chemist in order to know what's in your food. Here are some of the things that might have found their way into your kitchen if you were buying food for your family in the mid to late 1800s in this country. Sound appetizing? Many of these additives were not good for you, as you can imagine. Some of them were even toxic. I don't know if you recall, but a few years back, do you remember when there were a number of hundreds of thousands, actually, children who were sickened in China by formula that had melamine added to it? At the time, I remember thinking, how could this happen? What kind of society would let something like this happen? And I realized exactly the kind of society that we had about 120 years ago. One of the things that I discovered in doing my research for this exhibit was this notebook. It is a notebook that had belonged to a chemist who was doing investigations of foods that had been reported as adulterated. And I'll never forget, I was on the top of this ladder. It was on the stuff that I wanted seemed to always be on the very top shelf in the stacks in the archives. And I pulled out this notebook, and it was ancient, and it looked like it hadn't been opened since it had been written originally in the 1890s. And in the very first page, he's describing a candy sample that he collected, and he says, we need to pay very close attention to this because after eating it, 1 child died and 2 became sick. And I was stunned by this. This was something about our history that I had no idea about. Which brings us to our second food crusader. This is Harvey Wiley. Harvey Wiley was the son of evangelical Protestants. He was born in Indiana. He believed that adulterating food was really immoral, that it was an affront to nature. He became chief of the Bureau of Chemistry in 1883, and he wrote many studies and worked hard to try to have to get the government to regulate the food industry and prevent these adulterated foods from entering the market. For 20 years, he really had little success, even though there was mounting public interest in this by groups like the Federation of Women's Clubs. So he determined that he was going to do something, and what he did was he devised an experiment, and he used human subjects. He got 12 young men to volunteer to take all of their meals. For a number of years, many of these men were part of this experiment. They took their meals in this basement room in the Department of Agriculture, And he hired a professional chef, and they used only really fresh quality ingredients, but then they added borax, sulfuric acid, and formaldehyde in increasing amounts to their meals. And he watched and noted the results. He called this experiment the hygienic table. The press got a hold of it, and they gave it a new name. They called it the poison squad. At first, Wiley was a little bit disturbed about all of the attention it was getting and the name that it had, and people were making fun of it. In fact, there was a vaudeville song making fun of it, and they started calling him Old Borax. Not very flattering attention, he thought. But eventually he realized that this public interest in his experiment was going to benefit him, and it did. One person said about it, the picture of the little poison squad in Washington swallowing its daily dose of borax caught first the fancy of the press and then that of the public. In a few months, a single sensational venture did what 23 preceding years of laborious toil had failed to accomplish. And with the public outcry that followed this experiment, it helped sweep the Pure Food and Drug Act finally into reality in 1906. Another thing that caused a lot of public interest in the subject of food is probably more familiar to you. Have you all read The Jungle? Some of you have. I was required to read it in high school. I don't know if they still require you to do that, but it was sort of like the turn of the century's Food, Inc. Have you seen that movie? I can't buy chicken anymore. I always see I just keep imagining those little chicks on the conveyor belt and stamping their little heads. And, anyway, this was similar to that in novel form. Upton Sinclair wrote the book, of course, and President Theodore Roosevelt read it. He didn't agree with Upton Sinclair's politics. He called him a crackpot. He thought he was kind of nutty. But he was aware of the problem with food because when he was in the Spanish-American War, there was something called the embalmed beef scandal, which is as delightful as it sounds. Many men became violently ill for eating beef that was basically embalmed. So he was very concerned about this, and he wrote to Upton Sinclair, and Upton Sinclair responded with this 7-page letter, which we have, which was in the exhibition. Upton Sinclair had hoped to inspire labor reform and to get the public's attention on the problems of the working poor in this country and immigrants, but he's famous for having said, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach." There was, of course, a major outcry when they read his descriptions of the packing houses and the practices that went on there. We happen to have this series of postcards in our State Department files. They were sent in by an employee of the armor company who had a plant in South Africa. The postcards were produced in England, but they were circulating around the world. It was well known that you wanted to avoid meats from the Midwest. Another thing that helped pass the Pure Food and Drug laws was that some of the manufacturers eventually came around to realizing that it could help them. Wiley enlisted Heinz, the ketchup maker's support, by convincing them that the small companies were undercutting their prices because they could add chemicals to disguise their inferior products, and with this new law, they would no longer be able to do that. So beginning in 1906, after the law passed, you immediately see these labels, food labels, proclaiming the purity of their food and their compliance with the new Food and Drug laws. The Pure Food and Drug Act made it illegal to ship or receive adulterated or misbranded food. I love this photograph. These are some FDA agents, but it wasn't enough to just discover this toxic food. They had to build scientific and legal cases against them before they could be taken off the market. And here's a photograph of some ketchup that was, it says in the caption, was made from decomposed material. and they were fined $50. Unlike the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act, which was passed the same year, 1906, required that meats be approved before they went to market. So they sent investigators in to the packing houses. And we have this photo album of one of the packing houses, and it's showing how beautifully cleaned up everything is. It said, this one had a caption about the sausage girls who were moved upstairs where they could get sun and light. So the USDA was pretty proud of this new program. And in fact, I found this video that they produced, I think, in the early 60s. Basically, I think it's targeting teenagers to teach them all about this wonderful USDA inspection program. And I'll just tell you, I'm just going to show you a short clip from it, but I'll set the scene up for you. It features a young woman, a high school student named Janet, and she comes home. Her mother has left her a grocery shopping list, and she is very, very upset because she doesn't know how to grocery shop, and what's she going to do? And then a magical genie comes to her rescue and whisks her away. And here it is.
Oh, what's the use? She doesn't know any more than I do. Say, you're the kookiest. Who are you?
I'm a genie.
A genie, huh? Where'd you come from?
You ought to know. You brought me here.
I did.
Sure. You need help with your shopping, and that happens to be my business. I'm genie of the marketplace.
And I suppose you have a magic carpet?
No, I'm too rugged for rugs. I travel the jet stream. Ready to go?
Go. Where are we going?
Behind the scenes. And we've got some traveling to do.
Well, maybe I ought to wait for my mother. She'll be home soon.
Oh, your mother's already taken this trip.
She has. She never told me.
Couldn't you guess? You know what a smart shopper she is. Okay, let's make the scene.
Okay, you kooky genie. Let's go.
Come on, Janet. Pop on in. Atta girl.
Gosh, Genie, how did we get here?
Oh, you know, break one sound barrier and you break them all.
The meat,
Well, what are we doing here?
it's liver.
This is scene one, the meat packing plant. But suppose a real authority describes it to you. Friend of mine from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Name's George. We'll let George do it. Take over, George.
Glad to, Jeannie. I'm going to tell you about meat inspection. Let's begin with one of our key men, the USDA inspector in charge.
You get the idea. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I don't have much time left, and I wanted to talk a little bit about nutrition guides before I finish, because it's interesting to see the past, especially in light of what Professor Banzhaf is going to talk to you about. So the first nutrition guide were created after a man named Wilbur Olin Atwater performed some nutrition studies. And he basically learned that there are proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, and they have different energy values, and also that energy that isn't used by the body is stored as fat. And brought this fabulous news to the American people. They hired home economists to write guides. And so beginning in 1911, I think the first guide was written. The government started publishing these nutrition guides. The first one had 5 food groups. Later, at one time, they had 12 food groups. And as they learned more and more about nutrition, of course, they modified their guides. During the Great Depression, of course, malnutrition, unlike today, where it's just the opposite, malnutrition was a great concern. And they created this poster to show American parents what a healthy child looked like. And they also created this wonderful poster about 100-calorie portions, which I found fascinating, and I realized that they were probably using this to help get their calories up to a certain level, to the recommended level per day, as opposed to the dieting that we do now. I think I'll close with this. This is a World War II era food guide, and it's my favorite food guide, except for the one that I saw on the internet. Have you seen this one that's a pie chart of pie? So there's the cherry pie group and the pizza pie group and the, anyway. But this is a real one that they used during World War II, and we loved it because butter has its own food group on equal footing with green and yellow vegetables, and also because at the bottom it says, in addition to the basic 7, eat any other foods you want. So times have definitely changed. And of course, it's fascinating to look back at our history with food. It gives us great insight, I think, into where we are today. Thank you.
Thank you. So that was a wonderful historical perspective on the role of government in food and making our food safe and making sure that food is healthy. And it's a great transition to Professor Banzhaf, because really what he's about is ensuring that food is safe for the future. And he's a public interest law professor who inspired and was featured in the award-winning movie Super Size Me, about how the fast food industry is a major cause of the obesity epidemic. He's perhaps best known for using legal action to slash tobacco use in this country and ban smoking in public places, both here and around the world. However, he and his colleagues, including students here at George Washington University, have also more recently been very successful in likewise using legal action to fight obesity, which is our current food crisis in the United States. Rather than simply looking at specific government food-related programs, his focus here will be on seeing how a much wider variety of governmental actions can have and are having a significant impact on America's #1 food-related health problem, obesity, and what steps students and their professors can take now to make a significant difference in the real world. To go beyond merely thinking, talking, and studying to actually doing something about a major social problem. So he's going to try and inspire you all by explaining his own transformation from geek to gigolo to good doer, and urge you to likewise expand your horizons and do more than just write papers while at GW University.
Let me thank you for the introduction. I think somebody's sending an interesting subliminal message. You two both have small containers. I have a very large one, so perhaps somebody's sending me a signal here. Last time I was up on the stage was for live broadcast of the CNN program Crossfire, which used to originate from here. And a reporter named, or nicknamed, the Prince of Darkness was explaining to me why it'd be absolutely impossible and I would never be able to get fast food outlets and chain restaurants to disclose the calories in their foods. Well, of course, today, many fast food restaurants are already doing that, and by 2014, all of them will be required to do that. So we've already taken a small, but I think important step with regard to the issue of obesity. Now, I've been invited to be here today not because I teach about food, I don't. Study food, I don't. Write about food, I certainly don't. Or even that I know much about food, but rather simply because I sue the bastards. Usually I make trouble for the tobacco industry, but recently my law students and I have been going after the fast food companies, or actually food companies in general, which I think have to bear at least some responsibility for our current epidemic of obesity. I've been called the man who's taking big fat to court, a driving force behind the lawsuits that cost tobacco companies billions of dollars, legal academia's instigator-in-chief, the area's best-known radical law professor, and at one time, believe it or not, one of the 100 most powerful people in Washington, although I think they were exaggerating. On the other hand, I've also been called a legal terrorist, a legal flamethrower, a subverter of democracy, the Osama bin Laden of torts, and many things that I can't repeat in front of a responsible audience, or even here. Now, I hope you'll listen kind of carefully to what I have to say. I don't have any fancy slides and so on to distract you. If you want to see my videos, just look at the links which are up on the page. Because I'm going to say something to you which I don't think you've ever heard from any other professor here at the Harvard on the Potomac, as our former president used to put it. You know, I've never heard of Harvard being referred to the George Washington University on the Charles, but that's nevertheless what he called it, the Harvard on the Potomac. You know, our GW website proudly proclaims, quote, at GW, politics is not a spectator sport. Here, a stroke of genius can become a stroke of the president's pen. Quote, your 4 years at GW can change the course of history. Yet, I'm going to ask for a show of hands in a minute. When was the last time any of you were given an assignment which could possibly become a stroke of a president's pen or otherwise change the course of history? Anybody? Anybody? No, I think rather you're being asked to write a whole bunch of papers, which often wind up in the professor's circular file cabinet after being reviewed by a TA who's probably not much older than you and may not know very much more than you. Well, I'm going to try to change that because that's exactly what I did even as a student, and not much older than most of you are in the room today. You know, if you're looking at these ads, GW also says research at GW is at the intersection of policy and practice. Faculty and students don't just study the world, they work to change it. But again, when was the last time any of your professors actually asked you to go out and change the world? Or better yet, showed you how you could and provided concrete examples that you could, and where, in their words, policy is put into practice and challenged you to do the same? I don't think so. And of course, this very course says, we're always been told not to play with our food at GW, we're going to change the world. Well, maybe so. So, in any event, what I'm going to try to do here is to explain to you all how I, even as a student, much less once you graduate, could have a significant impact on the real world problems in the real world. And the problem here is food and food epidemic of obesity, but it could be food labeling or food safety or any of the others, or indeed any other thing that you're concerned about, like women's rights or environmental protection. As I said, that's exactly what I did even while I was a student, and I think not much older than many of you in this room here. Even though I'd never thought of myself as a public interest advocate of any kind or had any interest in many of the causes which were popular at the time that I was a student. I went to MIT. I was a typical geek. And that was long before being a geek was popular or at least acceptable, you know, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, that kind of thing. And like most geeks, I had no interest whatsoever in all the major movements which were then of interest to the other students. When I graduated from MIT, I went to probably the most politically conservative law school in the country. And there I just happened to be asked to write a paper on whether or not you could use copyrights to protect computer programs, because at that time they weren't protected by any kind of law. And so I wrote a paper, and I did the research, and I concluded that probably they should be protected by copyrights. But rather than just take that paper and publish it or give it to the professor, I decided I'd test my conclusion by asking the Copyright Office here in Washington, D.C. to actually copyright 2 test programs which I had put together, something the Copyright Office had never done before. And much to my surprise, they did. And so I got my name and picture in the New York Times. Yeah, a second-year student, I'm in the New York Times and everything else. Paper won a national contest, and the reason I think was not that it was so brilliant, which I don't think it was, but rather that I translated, in GW's words, policy into practice even as a student. something which I hope some of you might try as a result. And based on this, I was asked to come to Washington and testify before Congress on the need to revise the copyright law to include things like computer programs and data processing. I did, and as a result, the copyright law was in fact amended. So as a result of my stroke of genius, no, it wasn't a stroke of genius. Nah, let's call it a little bit of creativity. Quote, became a stroke of the president's pen, became law. And shortly after I graduated from GW, I went from being a geek to being a gigolo. At least in the original sense of the word. Anybody know the original sense of the word? No gigolos out there? Okay, well, gigolo comes from the word jig, a person who is paid to dance a jig with women. And that's what I did. I got a gig on a round-the-world cruise where my chief job basically was to dance at night with the unattached women. Great way to see the world at the time, very expensive. And they're still available, guys, still available. Okay, the day before we sailed, I sent off a 3-page letter to the Federal Communications Commission arguing that radio and TV programs, stations rather, should be required, if they broadcast cigarette commercials, to provide free time for so-called anti-smoking messages. You know, I sent it off. I didn't know what they were likely to do. Fortunately, they granted it. And as a direct result, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of anti-smoking messages aired for the very first time. Cigarette consumption dropped for the very first time. And somebody wrote an article at that time saying I had probably saved more lives than any doctor alive today. Well, you know, somebody who had just graduated and was totally apathetic, unconcerned about any causes, that was pretty heavy stuff. And I have to admit it. I got kind of turned on. And so I decided to switch from being a lucrative patent attorney, boring, unexciting, but very lucrative, and instead to become a public interest law professor, specializing, at least at that point initially, in the problem of smoking. And let me assure you that my taking that tiny little action had a very significant impact on a major problem. But it's not unique, and lots of other people have also had an impact. Let me give you a few quick examples. Margot Arnold was a 16-year-old girl. She almost single-handedly persuaded the city of Calabasas, California, to ban smoking on sidewalks and in most of the outdoor areas in Calabasas. This is now spread. If any of you ever go to beautiful downtown Burbank, as Jay Leno puts it, you can't smoke as you walk down the sidewalk. Oh, she also got to appear on the Today Show and was offered scholarships to a variety of colleges. A guy named Justin Kravitz, he was a young kid. He wasn't even in his teens. He successfully circulated a petition to ban smoking in cars when kids were present, and as a result, Bangor, Maine passed exactly such a law. A girl named Jackie Sparks, 16 years old, worked as a volunteer for a state lawmaker, and she's helping to persuade the state to move towards banning smoking when foster kids are in cars. And, well, Betty Carnes, she's a housewife, single-handedly persuaded Arizona to pass America's first anti-smoking, non-smokers' rights laws. And how many of you have seen the thank you for not smoking sign? No? She invented it, just a housewife. Oh, and four of my law students, only a few years older than you are, filed a petition for rulemaking, roughly the same kind of thing I'm going to ask many of you to do. And that started the non-smokers' rights movement, because we got smoking originally restricted and then banned on airplanes and now buses and in workplaces, growing number of public places, originally both in the US and now abroad. So in short, you, individuals, high school students, college students, graduate students, housewives, whatever you might be, you can translate policy into practice and have a significant impact on major social problems. Well, I see they're worried over there. Isn't this about food, right? When is he going to get to food? He's talking about smoking. Well, let me try to bring it to that, because the answer is that smoking and obesity are very similar public health problems in many ways. First, both are major social problems. They affect us all. Together, they cost us almost $500 billion a year. What do we just go through? 85 billion they were worried about. This is $500 billion a year, $5 trillion over 10 years, swamps Obamacare, a lot of money, and we're all paying for it. Secondly, although personal choice, individual responsibility obviously play a major role both with regard to smoking and obesity, the companies which promote the products, often with unfair if not deceptive ads, also I think must bear some responsibility for the end results. We're making them bear some of that responsibility because in effect they're making kids. Kids make decisions which will affect their lives before they're old enough, deemed competent enough to vote, to consent to sex, to enter into contracts, and I guess even to get a tattoo. Third, although both of these problems were once considered to be intractable public health problems because they involved lots of individual decisions by lots of individual people, we now know that both can be attacked very effectively through governmental action, including governmental action triggered by ordinary citizens like yourselves. For example, since my gigolo days, I went on to become a public interest law professor specializing in smoking, brought and encouraged lots of legal actions. We killed off Joe Camel and cigarette billboards, forced big tobacco to pay $250 billion, and yes, I said trillion, not billion, $250 billion to the governments and individuals. We most recently got Congress to pass, as part of Obamacare, a 50% surcharge on smokers. So just as I did when I was a second-year law student, once again I've been able, in GW's word, to take something which resulted in the stroke of the president's pen, sign the law. And that's what you can do, I think, in this area with regard to food. So let me try to briefly explain how some of these tactics have been effective in dealing with our nation's #2 public health problem after smoking, which is obesity. And once again, believe it or not, the story begins right here with GW. Several law students persuaded a Seattle lawyer to bring a class action lawsuit against McDonald's for misleading consumers about the fat in their French fries. Well, Mickey D first called it, frivolous, ridiculous, ludicrous. Yeah, but they wound up paying $12 million to get rid of it, and they apologized to the students, and they now make the disclosure, which we required them to do. And oh, by the way, the students went on to form their own nonprofit organization, which is fighting in this area. And that was the first of the so-called fat lawsuits. There have now been 10 successful fat lawsuits. And guess what? I wound up with a role in that movie, Super Size Me. Got me more recognition than all the law review articles and speeches and presentations that I'd ever done. Here I am in Super Size Me, and not as a bad example. All right, as a direct result of those 10 lawsuits, which after all, of course, are just another form of governmental action, like the one you described, we've achieved really amazing results in just the few years we've been doing it. It took us some 30 years with regard to smoking. A few quick examples. Kellogg Company has adopted nutrition standards for the food it advertises to young people. New York City banned all sugary soft drinks, most fattening foods, from its classrooms. Major bottlers like Coke and Pepsi have been forced to agree to virtually ban the sale of sugary soft drinks in schools, especially during school hours. And how many have seen the new Coke ads on the air talking about that? And finally fessing up to their role with regard to obesity. They're lying, of course, in part, but they're at least finally addressing it on TV. KFC, we got to remove trans fats, and that probably resulted in fewer fat calories. And quite a number of companies have been forced to stop marketing misleading claims about fats and calories in their food. Indeed, today in a leading law paper that I look at, there's an article called The Food Court. A whole bunch of food suits are piling up in one court because the judges happen to be pretty sympathetic to our point of view. And in addition to the things that grew directly out of the actions which my students brought, lawsuits tend to inspire publicity, create public pressure, remind legislators of things, and that's helped to do a number of things. As I said, we now have Obamacare requiring disclosure of fat and calories. We have limits in New York City and soon elsewhere on the size of sugary soft drinks which can be sold. Other places are banning fast food outlets around high schools. So legislation often grows out of these other kinds of legal action. And so as a result, the epidemic of obesity is finally beginning to taper off just a little bit, but it's still growing even though smoking is going down. And may not be surprising that this is a major problem. Americans get almost 40% of their calories from foods cooked outside the home, many from fast food restaurants. Indeed, a very careful econometric study by conservatives says that probably over 60% of our current obesity epidemic can be traced directly to the proliferation of fast food restaurants with their ubiquitous advertising, supersizing, and so on. We also know that the effect of all this extends far beyond the fast food outlets themselves. People, particularly young people, probably a lot of you, are becoming accustomed to much larger portions of things like French fries, hamburgers, and drinks. You may have some of the pictures, the old ones, where you had 8 ounces of Coke, and maybe 10 ounces of Coke, and you had a little bit, you showed some little bitty hamburgers. Well, we now come to expect we're going to have French fries like this, and quarter pounder, I think it's a third pounder, right? McDonald's now third pounder hamburgers. And we kind of begin to internalize that and expect it when we eat somewhere else. If we look at liquids, sugary drinks are the largest source of added sugar in the American diet. They're the primary source of added sugars in kids' diets, and they comprise more than 40% of the added sugar intake. Every single additional daily drink of Coke or Pepsi that you take, the risks of a child becoming obese increase by about 60%. So we know what the problem is. What can we do about it? Well, we know that obesity after smoking is the major cause of death, disability, disease in the United States. Again, it costs us all over $100 billion a year, most of which is paid by people who are not obese in the form of higher taxes and higher health insurance and so on. So it is a very big problem, and the question then is, what can we do about it? Well, we know, for example, that simply encouraging personal responsibility, individual responsibility, doesn't really work. As with smoking, educational campaigns and intervention aren't very effective or efficient. Did you know that after the Surgeon General released his report, his first report on smoking in 1964, for the first time, headline news, smoking causes cancer. What happened to smoking? It went up. It went up. Educational campaigns by themselves didn't work. Also, educational campaigns tend to be very expensive, which is the last thing taxpayers want to do now, is try to be taxed additional hundreds of millions of dollars to try to compete with the hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars worth of ads for sugary soft drinks, fattening foods, hamburgers, and so on. What can be done? Well, the answer is very simple. Governmental action works. And I'm not just talking about the traditional kind that my colleague introduced you to, but the kind that my colleagues and I are using. We've used it now with regard to smoking, and we're beginning to use it with regard to obesity. It's also necessary because nothing else seems to work. And by the way, you know, those of you who are concerned about using governmental action, that's what we do when we're serious about a problem. We run a lot of ads to battle against drunk driving, but in the end, we rely upon the power of governmental action. Yeah, we run public service ads aimed at reducing domestic violence, but we don't rely upon it. We don't rely upon personal responsibility. No, we use legal action. And for the same reason, I suggest to you we shouldn't hesitate to use legal action to fight the growing epidemic of obesity here. What can we do? Well, we've seen some of it. Higher taxes on sugary soft drinks, or especially fattening foods. Mandatory disclosure of calories at chain restaurants. Limits on the size of sugary soft drinks. Or how about warnings, like we have on virtually every other product, as to just how dangerous it is. There are many things that governments can do. And that's what I've been doing, and I'm hoping to use this course and your interest in the problems of food to get you to join me to do it. Because many years ago, some GW students asked the government to require foods sold in stores to list the calories and fat that they contain. Well, the government again agreed. And that's why you grew up having calorie counts and fat counts on all the products that you can buy in stores. And with the growing emphasis on the need to reduce healthcare costs, as well as to prevent more unnecessary deaths and so on, I think now is the time when your requests to governments, city, state, county, to do something about obesity are most likely to be heeded and to actually be adopted and put into practice. And that's why I came up with, I guess, what is kind of a novel homework assignment or problem for you. And that is, instead of just writing another paper to another TA and my circular filing cabinet, what you're asked to do is to write to a local government. It could be DC, it could be Arlington or Montgomery or wherever you happen to live. It could be your hometown, likely where your parents live, and ask them to adopt some measure to deal with the problem of obesity, particularly caused by sugary soft drinks. The easiest way to do it is follow the link I put up on the site to the very detailed explanation of why and how New York is doing it by limiting the size of sodas which can be sold. Then all you got to do is pick out one of the jurisdictions. You can usually find right on their website the email addresses and or snail mail addresses of the members of the DC City Council, Arlington Council, so on and so forth. And you write to them asking them to follow the lead of New York and do something about the problem of obesity. For all the reasons I've discussed, I think they are receptive. I know that in DC they are beginning to think about it. I know that in Cambridge, Mass., a place where Harvard hangs out and also MIT, perhaps for that reason they're thinking of doing it. New York State is thinking of following New York City's guide. And that's a rather simple homework assignment. If you don't like that approach, I think it's the least intrusive of all of the other approaches, then you can do one of the others. You can ask for example, a tax on sugary soft drinks. You can ask that sugary soft drinks not be exempt from the ordinary sales tax. You could try to prohibit the sale of sugary soft drinks in vending machines. You could require a per ounce pricing of sugary soft drinks, or you can follow the easy lead of New York and simply ban the sale of those over a certain size. And if you're not happy with all of those choices, you can pick any food-related problem, food scarcity, food safety, anything else, and likewise ask a local body to finally do something about it, to do something in the real world rather than just, quote, another homework assignment. Let me give you, I guess, 3 quick closing thoughts on this. First, looking around, I assume most of you are pretty cynical. Am I right? Yeah, most of you spend most of your life in this artificial school setting developing skills that you never really had much of an opportunity to use in the real world. And you're about to graduate into a world where there are fewer and fewer jobs where you can really use those skills that we taught you and you paid dearly to learn. And by the way, you're now graduating even from a university which is no longer even ranked, so probably you would be a little cynical. Well, let me tell you, when I was an undergrad, a geek, and then a grad student, I was even more cynical and probably even more apathetic than all of you. But these 2 opportunities presented themselves to me. The opportunity to test my ideas in the real world, not just to submit an ordinary homework assignment. And so first, as a student, secondly, shortly after graduating, I tried it, and quite frankly, it literally changed my life. From a geek to a gigolo to a good doer. You have the same opportunity to test your skills and your abilities in the real world. And not just before TAs or even professors who may not be really that competent to judge it in the real world, but before people who do have the competence to judge it in the real world. And if you persuade them, the DC City Council, the Arlington Council, New York, Cambridge, whatever, they can actually act upon them and put them into practice. And as it happened with me, it may happen to you. It may indeed literally change your life. Now, second, some of you probably consider yourselves conservatives or libertarian. And do you really want to make that determination now before you have any real practical experience? I don't know. But in any event, you may wonder if it's appropriate to use governmental approaches to solve major social problems like smoking and obesity. And I think the answer is clearly yes. For those of you who want the long answer, there's a book called Nudge, written by two libertarians, which explains it in great detail. But for those of you who don't have the time or that much interest, let's give you the shorter version. Why do we have a free enterprise system? Because we find that with regard to most decisions, these decisions are better made by individuals, hundreds of thousands of businesses, than by some pointy-headed bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. And that is true, because in making their decisions, how am I going to build this product? Am I going to use steel or aluminum? Am I going to use 2/3, 3/4? Am I going to have welds or something else? They are considering the relative costs and they're balancing and weighing them. But with regard to things like pollution or death as caused by cigarettes or death as caused by obesity, they do not bear any of those costs. They do not, therefore, plan on them, and that's why the system breaks down. Smoking, or I'm sorry, being a tobacco industry company, is tremendously profitable. Look at their stocks. Why? Because they don't pay any of the $300 billion worth of consequences that they inflict. So conservatives, libertarians, yeah, there is a good reason when the free enterprise system doesn't work, as we often hope and expect that it will, for you to go out, to take some action, and for governments to finally step in. Finally, I think many of you think that in choosing a career path, you may have to make a choice between doing good and doing well. Well, that's wrong. Having worked in the nonprofit area for more than 40 years, having started my own nonprofit organization, run that nonprofit organization for almost 40 years, raised tens of millions of dollars for that organization, I can tell you from experience that is false. It just is not true. There are many people in the anti-smoking field, in the anti-obesity field, in the environmental field, in the discrimination field, and all the others that I've worked with, and they make good six-figure salaries doing those kinds of jobs. One woman I'm particularly familiar with, she worked for a nonprofit initially as a data entry clerk, as a student, third and fourth year student. When she graduated, she was hired by them on a very low salary. Well, in a couple of years, she's now herself making a good six-figure income and doing very, very well. Her job involves a lot of international travel, dealing with celebrities. Recently helped set up a big conference up in New York at the World Health Organization. So you can do well by doing good. And in fact, my closing words are to wish you all well and hope that you will, when you graduate from here, do well. But I also hope that you do good. You can do well by doing good, no matter where it may take you in life. Thank you all.
Thank you. We have some time for questions. Before we move on, I spoke briefly with José. He really wanted to be here but couldn't make it. And he really wanted me to stress that although we're going to be, strong opinions are going to be expressed, these are not the opinions of the course or necessarily the university, but...
Do you say that with everybody or just somebody like me?
Just somebody like you.
I feel honored. Sorry.
Yes, it's an honor.
It's an honor.
But José wanted me to say that. But thank you. That was fabulous.
Sure.
We have plenty of time for questions. So if anybody has any questions, yeah.
Will the rest of your presentation be available for us afterwards?
Will the rest of my presentation be available?
I'm sorry, we didn't see your full slideshow.
Alice.
Yeah.
I'm happy to make it available.
And the Poison Squad, they
Yeah.
knew that they were signing up for that, but did any of them end up dying?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
The Poison Squad?
Oh, that's you, yeah.
No, we don't have any. We have anecdotal stories that say that none of them suffered any long-term harm. But some people say they did it for the free meals. They were young government employees, and but they also knew that, or felt that they were doing something good for the public.
Okay, and I'll further answer your question by saying that all my video stuff is up on the links that you posted, so if you want to see what it looked like when I appeared on The Daily Show or some of the others, that's where it is.
Hi, I was just wondering, you say that size of soft drinks and stuff is definitely a helpful legal action, but it's not necessarily true that it will reduce consumption.
Could you speak a little louder, sir?
It's not necessarily true that the size of a soft drink available is going to reduce consumption. Consumer preferences are much more multifaceted than that. People respond to prices, and so if you look at, if the size of soft drinks goes down to 10 ounces, and before you could get a 16-ounce drink, well, now you can get 2 10-ounces, and you're drinking 20 ounces of soda. So I think, and I also think it's kind of presumptuous to say that, reduction in obesity is necessarily going to reduce healthcare spending when mortality rates aren't even factored into the position. And these are all things that are not necessarily clear in the research that I've read, especially by University of Chicago economists. So how do you respond to something like that?
All right, let's take the last first because that's the easiest one. The survey, the study you're referring to talked about mortality, which is dead. Morbidity, which is disease, very, very well firmly established. You can read lots of studies on the CDC website or somewhere else. With regard to the size of the beverages, again, if you want to look at it, you can look at a much more detailed explanation, but the simple version is this. One of the problems is the economies of scale. When you go in and you buy, say, 12 ounces at McDonald's or at your local movie theater, you pay a certain amount of money. Probably most of that, 90% of it, is not the beverage. It's the person serving it, it's the rent, it's the upkeep, and so on and so forth. For almost nothing, they can double the size, and that's a very, very enticing kind of thing when you're presented with it. Again, you can read the book Nudge, and they'll explain it in more detail. So if you want to do something about the problem of sugary soft drinks and obesity, yeah, you could ban them, you could ban the sale to kids, you could put a high tax on them, you could do a lot of things. But here the idea is simply saying if you want more than 16 ounces, you can have it. You just have to buy 2 containers. And the answer is yes. It'll cost you a little bit more money, and you'll have to carry that plus your gigantic popcorn to your seat, and probably many people will not. And in the end, you'll reduce obesity and your taxes, or at least your parents' taxes.
So we mentioned Upton Sinclair's work, The Jungle, and I know his main motivation in writing it was the poor condition for poor and immigrant workers. Mm-hmm. In light of the fact that immigrant workers are still working in horrible conditions in the meat packing industry and also in a lot of other aspects of the food industry, do you think there's going to be another comparable work like The Jungle that will have a similar impact? Or is there a work that already exists?
I would say works like Super Size Me and Food Inc. are kind of today's jungle, and I certainly imagine more of those coming out.
And to answer it more broadly, I think if you look at The Silent Spring, that was one of the books which kicked off much of the, what we today call the environmental movement, which also, of course, uses legal action. And wasn't there a big feminist trek about 35 years ago, ladies, that kicked off the modern feminist movement? Nobody knows what I'm talking about? Okay, I'll pass.
Quick question with Professor Banzhaf. With legislation involving companies like KFC, you mentioned getting rid of their trans fat and having them announce that as well. Would it actually be to the company's benefits that they can advertise these things, considering the new trend in healthy eating, and if we work on legislation or government legislation to put pressure on the fast food companies to make their food healthier? Would it also serve as an incentive when writing these off to the companies as well?
Okay, let me see if I understand the question. First of all, can you always trust the companies to do what they're saying or they promise? The answer is no. One of the suits that I didn't mention was a second follow-up suit against McDonald's, which with a great deal of fanfare promised that they would get the trans fat out, and then secretly they didn't do it, and they got sued again, and I think it was $8 or $9 million. Would legislation be helpful? In many situations it would. I gather you're talking about national legislation from the Congress. The problem is, who's going to go up against the mighty fast food, regular food, sugary soft drink industry? They've got a tremendous amount of clout in Congress. They tried to push through what was called the cheeseburger bill. What was it doing? It was aimed at the lawsuits that people like myself and my students and others were filing against the major companies. They argued that it was unfair. They were outgunned. 6 law students against McDonald's. Somehow that was unfair. And so they had a hearing up on the Hill. 6 people testified in favor of the bill, the need for the bill. Only 1 testified against it. That was me. That's where I was accused of subverting democracy. So yeah, if you can get legislation passed, that's wonderful. But often what you have to do is bring legal action rather than wait for legislation. If you look at many of the major movements in this country, the civil rights movement started with what? What lawsuit? Brown v. Board of Education. That I hope you've heard of. The disability rights movement started with a case called the Park case right here in D.C. That created a lot of political pressure, eventually created the Americans with Disability Rights movement. There are half a dozen other movements which started because of litigation rather than waiting for regulation. Do you think when I filed that Fairness Doctrine complaint, I could have gone to Congress and said, Congress, I think really what you ought to do is require all the broadcasters to present hundreds of millions of dollars worth of anti-smoking messages and drive cigarette sales down? No. So often we have to litigate before we can get them to legislate.
We spoke about all calorie intake and the effect that that's having on obesity, but I feel like we're missing a big part of the conversation, and that's exercise. So how do you think exercise or legislation can be used to increase the exercise of our individuals?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because I think it's an interesting one. And also I'm going to go through my notes quickly, because I wrote some of it down. I'm a great admirer, for example, of First Lady Michelle Obama's Let's Move Active Schools campaign, because obviously exercise can be important, and legislation requiring schools to provide more physical exercise can be important, but let's not overemphasize it, and let's not do what McDonald's is trying to do, which is saying it's the answer to the problem. How many of you have ever had Ronald come to your schools? Well, Ronald McDonald is now going to schools. He's the health ambassador, they say. And he's trying to convince you that don't worry about all this fast food, just get a little bit more exercise. To me, it's like having Joe Camel come into your schools and say, yeah, kids, you can smoke, just don't inhale. Don't inhale very much. So I actually did the calculations. Let me tell you what it would be. Mighty Kids Meal. They're aimed at children 7 to 8 years of age. So to burn the typical calories in an 800 calories, typical 7-year-old girl, she'd have to play volleyball for over 8 hours. I love volleyball, but I've never played it for 8 hours. She could walk for 9.3 hours, work it off, sure. Oh, and how about the older one, say a 10-year-old kid? Did some calculations here. Typical, all too typical, unfortunately, McDonald's meal. He'd have to play volleyball for 13 hours, baseball for 10.5 hours, swim for 8.8 hours. I used to be a swimmer, but not 8 hours, guys. So, yeah, exercise can be an important component, but don't be misled into thinking that all you got to do is get a little bit more exercise and you're going to meet the problem. And those of you who go over to our Hellwell every day or every other day and get on the machines, you can actually push the buttons and you can run for 30 minutes or 40 minutes, and you look there and it's, depending on your weight and size and so on, 200-300 calories. You know how many calories is in a typical McDonald's meal? I hate to tell you. So keep exercising.
I just wanted to add that Wilbur Atwater, the nutrition scientist, said in about 1890 that Americans eat too much fat, too many sweets, and don't get enough exercise. So things haven't changed too much.
And no internet, no video game.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I think it's actually really inspiring, but I thought another part of the conversation that was missing was the entire cost side, and I think fast food is usually such an easy, accessible option because it's simply so cheap. So I was wondering what you thought could be done on the other side of the movement in trying to make good, healthy produce much cheaper and a bit more cost competitive with processed foods like fast food.
Well, I think most of that would go to my colleague here who knows much more about the federal support program and the subsidy program. From what little I know about it, we subsidize all the fattening foods. We don't subsidize, or in many cases penalize, the healthier foods. And obviously that creates a problem. There are other ways in which it can be done. But if we want to go direct supply and demand, what we could do would be to put a progressive tax onto fattening foods. One of the reasons why so many people, particularly poor people, go to McDonald's for their food is it's a very cheap source of fat and calories. If we put additional taxes on it, we could reverse that. Or, even all we got to do is say, let's not exempt them from sales tax. When you go into a store here in DC or Arlington, wherever you are, most of the products you buy have a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5% sales tax. And you have to pay it. But we exempt food on the theory that we don't want to keep some poor, starving kid from buying, eating potatoes or fruit or whatever it might be. Well, that doesn't apply so far as I can see when you buy a Coke or a Ding Dong or a Yoo-Hoo or many of these others. So all we have to do is say, you pay the same tax as everybody else. That'd be one way of doing it. You want to jump in on your?
I don't really have anything to add. I would say if you're interested in that, what I've learned about it hasn't come so much from my research at the National Archives as from reading books like The Omnivore's Dilemma. I think that's pretty accurate, though.
If you don't ask questions, we give a quiz.
There's one over here.
I'm not sure if any of you have seen the video that I think it came out last week on the New York Times website. It was about how a lot of the calorie counts on a lot of the foods that we eat regularly are wrong and not accurate. So I was wondering, what do you do when you have these laws that require the counts, but they're not being used effectively?
Tell you what they can do and are doing, 3 magic words: sue the bastards. If the government requires disclosure, whether it's of interest on mortgages or risks of certain investments or the number of calories in a food, and they deliberately underestimate them, they can and should be sued. Simple.
One of the things that's been kind of established over the last couple of years has been the idea that high fructose corn syrup is much worse for you in the long run than sugar is. One of the reasons high fructose corn syrup is sort of in everything we eat is because it's hugely subsidized by the federal government. There's large tariffs on sugar production, either if it's here or overseas, and a lot of implicit subsidies are given by the government to corn producers. It would seem to me that's a fairly good example of a law of unintended consequences. We put the corn subsidies in place to keep corn farmers during the Depression better off, to make sure they wouldn't starve, and now it's in turn made us fat. Why shouldn't we sort of take a skeptical look at lawsuits and the power of government to dramatically change the way that we eat things when we see that one of the best and clearest examples of a policy designed to make us better fed and have better incomes, all it did over the last, call it 100 years, was make us dramatically more overweight?
Well, I think you're mixing up legislation and litigation. And by litigation, I mean not just suing in court, but also going before regulatory agencies. Because the big difference is in Congress, the other side, whether it's the tobacco industry or the fast food companies or the sugary soft drink companies, have tremendous clout and tremendous power, and they can do things which may not be in the public interest. Often the only remedy, the best remedy, sometimes the only remedy, is litigation going the other way. Now, some of the ads, and I believe even the recent Coke ads, are saying a calorie is a calorie is a calorie. Well, I can't get into it, but from what I understand, it ain't true. And that there are differences between the calories coming from high fructose corn syrup and from others. Also, there are suits pending against exactly this issue. There's a question of whether or not when the product contains high fructose corn syrup, they actually have to list it as sugar, or I think they're now calling it evaporated sugar cane, some crap like that, which nobody knows what it means. There are lots of laws out there which are weird, but the problem is of changing them. Let me give you an example. If you buy a container of mayonnaise, in most cases, it doesn't tell you that a major ingredient is egg yolks, which are not the kind of thing you want to have if you're close to a heart attack. Why don't they list the ingredient? Because Uncle Sam has established what we call standards of identity. Certain foods must have certain things in them. To be called mayonnaise, it must have egg yolks. And of course, every housewife or house husband who goes shopping has a copy of the Federal Register in their back pocket, so they whip it. You're saying that you don't? Well, let me tell you very quickly. My students one day went to Giant Foods and said, yeah, the federal government doesn't require you to do it, but you're consumer-minded. Why don't you list egg yolks on the label of your mayonnaise? You could do that. Government doesn't prohibit it. And all around this big table, the guy said, well, everybody knows it's in there. Everybody knows it's in there. We all know it's in there. Then one little guy at the corner piped up. He said, no, wait a minute. I had a heart attack 2 years ago. I'm living on borrowed time. I've been told not to eat egg yolks or anything which is high in cholesterol. He says, I didn't know it. And so I turned to them, I said, well, if somebody working for the damn food industry who's got a college degree doesn't know what's in your mayonnaise, maybe many of your customers don't. And that was what persuaded them to put that on there. So I don't hold my breath waiting for Congress to step in and save you. But the interesting thing is, probably more than 100 people here, if all of you write to the DC government, they're about to consider doing here what they're doing in New York with the sugary soft drinks. If you want to do it somewhere else, that's fine. New York State, those of you who come from New York State, wherever it is. And again, you might not just change the world a little bit, you might change your own lives. Not that you'll become a gigolo.
And we have one last question.
Hi, I'm actually in favor of taxing high sugar large drinks, but you also talked about the idea of taxing processed foods instead of considering them basic foodstuffs. And you also talked a lot about how a lot of those foods are oftentimes consumed by people that are poorer in the US. And taking away processed foods is also taking away a level of convenience because you would be forcing them to cook more. And that's part of why they're eating the processed foods, is because they come from times with less family for this. Are any of your organizations or your students' organizations working on the counter effect of making healthy food more accessible, both as far as location and price, to people that need it?
Okay, I think you're addressing it to me, although I never said, I think, anything about a higher tax on processed foods. What I suggested is that we could have a tax on very fattening foods, where the calorie density is far higher measured against their nutritional value. If we do that, you will encourage the foods which poor and other people have to eat healthier foods. But it's not a question of processed versus unprocessed. It's a question of whether they're calorie-laden and no nutrition. And what's the food which has the most calories and no nutrition? Soda, right. Guy gets the A from listening.
But then you're still pushing food out of their price range. So do you have any counter initiatives to force people to put grocery stores in those areas to make the healthier foods more affordable?
There are a number of initiatives moving in that direction. Unfortunately, that seems to require more in the nature of legislation rather than litigation. So if the food stores are resisting, you may not be successful, but if you're interested in that, why don't you send your proposal to the DC City Council? One of my colleagues, Mary Che, a law professor, is on there. They are generally activist and interested in consumer protection. So their emails are right up on their website, and do it as your homework. Maybe you'll get an A, and even if you get an A or a B, if you get them to do something, it could change your life.
And on that note, I want to thank both our speakers today. Thank you so much. It was fabulous. And they might stick around for further questions if you have them.